Welcome. I am Sasha Coulter-Wasserman, Associate Curator and Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Project at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. And I am pleased to be here to talk with artist YZ Kami in today's program, Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, a conversation with YZ Kami. Our conversation is part of a series of public programs called Waiting for the Future, presented by the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi in this time of global pandemic. In this series, we invite you to meet artists virtually, to see their work and how they express themselves in visual art, dance, and film before and during COVID-19. In today's program, we will explore themes of oneness and transcendence in the paintings of YZ Kami. Today, Kami is speaking with us from his studio in the countryside of New York. I visited him there recently, observing social distancing, of course. And while we're not able to do this talk together today, I'm pleased that we have this opportunity for all of our viewers to visit with him virtually. Although we are separated by screens and time zones, we hope you'll feel that we are all in the same room by sharing your questions for Kami in the YouTube comment box during the conversation. In the final 15 minutes of this program, we will get to as many of your questions as possible. We are here today with internationally acclaimed artist YZ Kami, who draws on a diverse range of influences from Islamic architecture and sacred literary texts to Sufi poetry and existential philosophy. His oeuvre encompasses collage, sculpture, painting, and photography. Across these mediums, the defining element is a concurrent exploration of abstraction and figuration. What unifies his work, bridging these inspirations and media, is a deeply meditative quality that evokes quietude and self-reflection. The artist who signs his work, YZ Kami, was born Kamran Yousefzadeh in Tehran. An early interest in philosophy led him to study that subject at the University of California, Berkeley, before he moved to Paris, where he received a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts from Université de Paris, Sorbonne. He went on to study film at the Conservatoire Libre du Cinéma Français, and after film school, he moved to New York in 1984, where he currently lives and works. Kami's work has been exhibited at venues that include the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., and the National Museum of Contemporary Art, Athens. He has participated in the Istanbul Biennial, the Venice Biennial, and the Liverpool Biennial. His work is in museum collections, including those of the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. We are especially proud to have two paintings by Kami in the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Collection. Kami, let's start with these works because they exemplify the ways in which your painting spans the diverse styles of figurative portraiture and architectural abstraction. So, here we see your 1990 painting, Self-Portrait as a Child. While slightly smaller than your more recent portraits of massive scale, it prefigures that later work with its embedding of the child's portrait within a veiled, ghosted image of women having tea in a garden. Literally blurring the boundaries between photography and painting, between the real and the imagined, it has a dreamlike quality in its exploration of memory and metaphysical self-discovery. Tell us what we are seeing and how you made this work. That is, why did you choose the synthesis of painting and photography?
In the late 1980s, I did a trip to Iran after a number of years. And there at my parents' house, I came across a small black and white photograph of myself as a child. In the picture, I look like having like 10 or 11, being 10 or 11 years old, dressed very formally with a bow tie. I took the picture back with me to New York, and I started to make a series of work based on that. First was like sketches, then drawings, then I did some works like oil and paper after the picture. And then I started to blow the photograph up and make a grid and mount it on linen and canvas and make this very large portrait or self-portrait. And I've been working obsessively, I was working obsessively after this image for a couple of years. And then one day I came across in a magazine of like a number of pictures from Russia at the beginning of 20th century. And one of the pictures that took a lot my attention was of a group of 3 women around a table having tea. As soon as I looked at the picture, I saw a very large painting of this scenery with a portrait of mine after that childhood portrait painted at the middle of the image. This came to my mind really like a flash. I saw the painting. Without asking myself the meaning of it, I started in my studio, I started to do a painting, and this is what you see here. The scenery of the 3 women having tea is painted with colors, although it was a black and white picture, and then the portrait of the boy is painted with oil. I mean, it's sort of like a grisaille, what we call grisaille, black and white, oil on top of a terracotta background on canvas. That's why you see also some red. Afterward, I started to put a whitewash on the scenery of the women, but for many sessions of whitewash, and then I waited till it dried for several days and again. And then finally I got this feeling of like, as if there is a sheer there, and we are looking at them through a sheer, and then the boy is very present. The painting has a very mysterious feeling, somehow connected to memory, and probably that is like a sheer of memory. Although the scenery is not at all Persian, but when I saw it and while I was painting it reminded me a lot of Russian writers that I loved and admired growing up in Iran as a teenager, and especially Chekhov and the 3 sisters that you see here. And just an anecdote that my mother had 2 sisters, so I had that memory of those 3 having tea and chatting, although that was Iran in the mid-late 60s.
It's so nice to hear your recollections of this important trip and to hear you transport us back in time and tell us the story behind the discovery of the source image for this portrait, and also take us through your working process in these earliest figurative works. In contrast to the figuration of self-portrait as a child, this work, also in the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Collection, Prayers XIII, which dates from 2008, is emblematic of your abstraction. And architecture is really a motif that unifies your Endless Prayers series. You first used the transformative force of spiritual imagery in a series of black and white photographs of Islamic memorial sites. And here we are looking at an installation view of your 1996 diptych. Let's talk about the role of architecture and its connection to the sacred in your work. How did architecture become a structural element, a predominant aesthetic in your work?
As far as I remember, I always had a deep connection with architecture, particularly the sacred architecture. What I had seen traveling in Iran with my family as a teenager and later abroad, and looking at old Persian architecture and Islamic architecture. And later I traveled and saw Byzantine architectures in Europe and also in Turkey, Basilica. The idea of the temple and contemplation has always been with me. And the ceiling of a sacred structure has a particular meaning. It usually used as a metaphor of heaven. I use the geometry of ceiling as a base for my endless prayers and dome series. In this image that you showed, this is the very first time that I worked with this concept. It's a photographic work and that is all cut in pieces in a grid, and is an iris printed photograph and like a watercolor paper that was cut in pieces and mounted on linen on a grid. And it's here is the installation at MoMA in New York at exhibition Architecture as Metaphor, that I had the possibility to install them like in an angle that the tension between the two poles be visible. This is probably the first time I show work that is not connected to portraiture per se and human presence, concrete human presence, and this can be the very beginning of the Endless Prayers series and the dome paintings. And after this, the other work that I did before starting the Endless Prayers was this sculpture that I made for Istanbul Biennial 2005, which is the same concept of like concentric circles, that here it is made out of soapstone, which is like a stone that has a very beautiful gray. And in concentric circle, there is one poem of Rumi, a love poem from the book of Shams Tabrizi, is stamped on the circle. And each circle is a repetition of one word of that verse, the verse of the poem. And the center, what you see is a salt that gives this whiteness that years later, few years afterward, I explored that in my white painting, white dome series. The salt there gives that very white light, and also salt has like that allegorical meaning in alchemy that facilitate the transfer to different inner spaces. I can see these two works, the diptych, the untitled diptych, and this sculpture that is called Rumi, the book of Shams Tabrizi, in memory of Mahine Tajaddud. Anyhow, these two are the very first works that that are done before the Endless Prayers.
And Kami, I think, in both of the works that you've just shown, we see this concentric circles. And in the Endless Prayer series, you really give the viewer a sense of infinite repetition without a traditional dependence on perspective, disorienting us while orienting us in the repetitive and meticulous detail. Please describe your working process and methodology for a work like this.
The work of, the Endless Prayers series are based on geometry and text. And the geometry for myself, it refers to the ceiling. And as I mentioned before, and the ceiling is like a metaphor for heavens. But this is an abstract ceiling. It's not a concrete ceiling because it doesn't have a perspective. It's all the same size. I mean, all the bricks or all the rectangulars are the same size, and the space between the circles stays the same. And this is to convey the idea of infinite, that the circles, they stopped at the borders of the canvas. Otherwise, they could go on and on to the infinite. And the way this work is done is that there are poems and some are prayers that I print on a very thin rice paper and cut this rectangular and mount it on linen. And this creates a very simple mandala. Mandalas are in all civilization, you find this circular, archetypal circular forms that are common to many different cultures. And then on the rectangulars, they are always in this series, there are texts that are mostly poetry and sometimes prayers.
So tell us more about the use of text and the role of poetry in the series.
The poetry used in Endless Prayers is, the poetry is mostly from Rumi, and the two canon of one is the book of Masnavi, and the other is the mystical love poems, the Divan of Shamset-Tabrizi. There is also sometimes poems by Hafiz that I use, 14th century Persian poet that I adore. The repetition of the geometry and the repetition of the rectangles it gives this feeling of like a mantra, and then the repetition of the verse which is printed on each. So it has a very obvious reference to like mantras that in Sufism they call it zikr, and then you have it in Buddhism, you have it in Judaism, in Christianity, to repeat a word or repeat a verse or repeat, the divine name. That's what it is. That's where the text come from.
Thank you. So turning to your next works, the White Dome series, here the words that you just spoke about that were integral to the Endless Prayers series disappear, giving way to the monochrome. Tell us about the experience that you want to convey through the White Dome series.
In White Dome paintings, the text totally disappears. And what remains is just pure white paint. Rectangular shapes become totally white, and then they are painted with brush, one next to another. Sometimes in some dome paintings, I use square, and which I stamp next to each other. That refers more to a mosaic. And so the only color that you have is the color of the linen, which is the background, which is like this earth color. And then the center is all painted in white, the center where the light comes from, which is the center of the dome. And there is no background visible. It's all painted in white, that gradually the white paint disappears into the texture of the canvas. And as I said about endless prayers, you can see there is no perspective here. They're all just a repetition of the same size rectangle that goes on and on and on and stops at the border of the canvas. And behind it is this concept or experience that of the white light that many mystics they refer to in different traditions. I tried to convey, or imagine to myself, to imagine what could be that the experience or that emanation of the white light, pure white light.
So we began this conversation with your earliest portraiture, and after seeing these two abstract series that followed, one element that might surprise viewers is the concurrent practice of figuration and abstraction in your work. Tell us about the style of portraiture, the massive scale and the dreamlike meditative state of the sitters of your works, as we see here.
I've been painting portraits since I was a child, since I was literally like 5-7 years old. And I always said that I became a painter in order to be able to paint a human face. There's no subject matter in painting that interests me as much as the human face. And for many years, since the childhood and during all my studies, on my teenage years in Iran, I was in high school, and then my studies in university abroad, I always painted portraits. I've always painted faces. And for me, before, meaning prior to late 1980s, it was, the faces were always the human size, meaning, the small portraits. And I always had a seater sitting in front of me as a model for the painting. And in the late 1980s, as I mentioned before, and early 90s, I started to make portraits larger and larger. And then there I stopped using live sitter and using photograph and snapshots that I used to take as a model for my paintings. These paintings that you're showing now here, these are like starts almost at the same time as the endless prayers. That the portraits, before them, my portraits always, the sitter would always look at you with big eyes. And in some of them, I had this reference to those Roman Egyptian portraits called Fayum that I love, the subject matters with huge eyes staring at you that you see in museum in Cairo, in Metropolitan, in Louvre, in British Museum, etc. Some of my paintings had a reference to them. But then around the time of endless prayers and the Rumi sculpture, I started to paint. First of all, the figure became, as we call, monumental. And then I started to lower the gaze of the sitter, either closed eyes or gaze down. And then to refer to like a meditative state, or I don't know, introspective or introverted. The gaze went inside, and obviously it changes the whole experience, because when the subject matter is looking at you, the eyes become the most prominent part of the portrait. But here, the whole surface of the face is the subject matter. And I continue obviously to paint portraits, to paint faces. As I said, that's my main occupation besides other things in painting. But I do now both. There are some paintings that the gaze is down or the eyes are closed, and some that they are open and look at the viewer.
And I think really returning to the way in which you bridge abstraction and figuration across your work, let's look at your most recent series, the Night Paintings, which you began in 2017. So here we're seeing links to the Endless Prayers series with the significant incremental element of a relationship between abstraction and figuration. They are, in some sense to me, conjoined here in a work that is mainly abstract with its indigo color of the night, yet the imagery is the mindscape of a dream within an indigo sleep. Is this a fusion of your dual practice of abstraction and figuration, and what inspired it?
These paintings are totally new for me. As you said, I started them around 2017, and I showed for the first time a group of 12 of these paintings last January 2020 at Gagosian in Rome. And for me, it's like a new departure that I'm going to also pursue next to the other interests. And I think the first paintings of this series, they came out of my readings of the poetry of William Blake, which I love, and he's an extraordinary poet. He's also a painter. He was also a painter. I'm less interested in his painting and more in his poetry. They are mostly abstract. I would like to give the feeling of give a feeling of visions, that these are like visions or dreams, stuff that happen mostly at night. That's why I call them night paintings. And they're all painted with this color that you mentioned, with oil, indigo. And it is said that indigo is the color of the night. And they are called night painting. This one, which was also at this exhibition at Gagosian, which was called Night Paintings. This one has a very visible figures. It is called the Great Swan. The origin, it comes from a 19th century photograph of the Indian saint Ramakrishna. In the photograph, we have Ramakrishna standing surrounded by his disciple. There is a smile in his face, the face that you don't see in my painting. And it is said that this picture is at the moment that Ramakrishna was in what they call samadhi, he was in ecstasy. In the painting that is also painted with indigo, entirely indigo and white, the upper body and the face of the saint disappear in this like mist of indigo, and then you have these devotees surrounding him. I call the painting the Great Swan, which is a translation of Sanskrit word Paramahamsa. That is, you refer to a very great holy man, Paramahamsa, the Great Swan.
I think, Kami, as we're seeing here, the Great Swan is really such a beautiful combination of your signature abstraction and figuration. But turning to the present situation in which COVID-19 has affected us all, and especially artists worldwide, tell us about the impact of the shutdown on your practice.
Since the pandemic, I've been spending most of my time in my studio in the countryside outside New York. Although I try to go back every week to the city, to my studio in the city, I don't want to be completely disconnected with the life of the city. You know, the whole world has changed. It is a very introspective moment. It is a time to be in here rather than out there. Of course, one is constantly concerned and, you know, about one's loved ones and others generally. My daily routine has not changed. Like before, I spend most of my time in the studio, either working or trying to work or pushing to work. Right now, I'm working on a series of very small portraits, very small and very concentrated. Also continuing to work on night paintings.
So I think we'd like to open it up now, thank you, Kami, to questions from our audience for you. And I think we have some coming in now. The first is, what are you most looking forward to working on after this time of pandemic?
But, you know, things that affect, I mean, in my case, things that affect my life and has a very big impact on me, and like probably for most of people is the same, or most of artists is the same. It started like pandemic was like a huge thing in all of us around the globe. It changed everyone's life, and this kind of thing, the effect on your work, the effect that it will have in my work, I cannot know now. It always comes later in the future. Sometimes years later, sometimes months later. Actually, I look forward to see what will change and what effect this whole experience will have on my work.
And we have a lovely next question that sort of bridges these thoughts together. What gives you hope?
Life. I love life. And that's it.
So I think we're still waiting for some questions to come in from the audience, and would encourage you all to please send them into the YouTube chat and have this opportunity to ask Kami some questions directly about his work. One more question that's come in is, how do you select the portrait models? How do you select the subjects for your sitters?
It's very intuitive. It's the subject matters are friends, families, friends of friends, and sometimes total strangers that I go to, that I meet somewhere, and I go to and I ask if they're willing to sit for me. Sometimes, obviously, most of the time they don't, but sometimes they do. And then friends and families, friends and strangers. And the selection comes, very intuitively. There are periods that I like to, I look for like older faces. I like to paint faces with a lot of history on, sometimes not. It's sort of random, but intuitively random.
And in terms of the human face, this next question asks, what does it mean for you? What about the human face are you trying to capture?
I mean, the human face is like such an ocean of nuances and feelings and layers that actually I think I never succeeded to capture what I see there. But it's always how do you say, a démarche to try to capture something. It's like a vast field of feeling and emotions.
And tell us also, one audience member has asked about the titles of your portraits. They've noted that many of them are indeed untitled, but there are portraits that have subtitles that are descriptors, including what the subject is wearing, and others that have names. And in your most recent series of night paintings, for example, we looked at paintings that are titled, for example, The Great Swan. Can you tell us about the practice of titling your work over the course of your career?
Titling the work is a very weird thing. Sometimes a title comes to you very naturally and you think it sounds right. And sometimes you cannot come up with a title. And in that case, I call the work untitled. Sometimes I used to, all my portraits or most of them used to be, a vast majority of them used to be untitled because I wanted to, convey that it's not about a specific person, it's about human being. But then there are some that I started to either refer to them with their name or with their profession, like one that is called the gardener, or one that is the name of the sitter. And title is a very tricky thing. Sometimes it comes by itself, and sometimes you look for it and you don't find it.
Thank you so much, Kami. I would like to extend my special thanks to you for joining me today for this live conversation. And thank you to the team behind the scenes in Abu Dhabi and in New York for making this program and live broadcast seamless. We hope you will join us again on November 24th for the final program of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Waiting for the Future series, a performance by Selma and Sufyan Ouissi.